Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies event on Centering Human Rights in Ukraine's Reconstruction. My name is Michelle Struck, and I am the Khosravi Chair in Principled Internationalism and the Director of the Human Rights Initiative and the Humanitarian Agenda here. And we are coming to you at this event at a time that is more significant than ever, with President Biden just addressing the world about the historical commemoration of D-Day and talking about how critical it is for the US to support Ukraine and how essential it is for Ukraine to win, because essentially if they don't, all of Europe will be threatened. Given the events on the world stage and the fact that just next week, the 2024 Ukraine Recovery Conference will be held, this is such an important time to take stock of where human rights are situated in this situation, and understanding that the vision of human rights that Ukrainians are fighting for every day is so essential in determining how realistic that will be in the reconstruction and how important that is in terms of geopolitics. So it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists that will be joining us today to have this important conversation and to launch the new report that CSIS just released this week called A Human Rights-Centered Approach to Reconstruction in Ukraine. So it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists for the discussion today. First, Scott Busby, who is a current senior associate at the CSIS Human Rights Initiative. He spent more than 30 years working on human rights, refugee, and migration issues with the US government and the United Nations, and most recently served for 10 years as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Following Scott, after Scott speaks, we will hear from a panel that has Melinda Herring and Bill Van Esveld as well. And I will give Scott an opportunity to present first the report that I mentioned, and then I'll give an introduction to Melinda and Bill so we can have a discussion. For those who are joining us online, if you'd like to submit a question for our distinguished panel, please just go to the event page and use the Ask Live Questions function. We will get your questions and we can integrate those into the discussion. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Scott Busby to talk a little bit about the report that CSIS just released.
Thanks very much, Michelle, and thanks to all of you for joining. I'd like to reiterate what Michelle just said about the importance of the larger geopolitical context in which this conflict is taking place, and the fact that the abuses, humanitarian law violations, and general aggression launched by the Russian regime against Ukraine continues to be and should be the primary focus of attention in our efforts to help Ukraine. That said, the process of reconstruction is not one that can wait until the end of the conflict. It is a process that is already happening, and obviously, if and when the conflict ends, will become super important. And the primary point of the report is that reconstruction needs to be done in the right way, with respect for human rights and principles of democratic governance, in order to avoid future tensions and conflicts within Ukraine. To that end, the report reviews the various efforts to consider human rights and governance commitments that have come up over the course of the reconstruction planning process. And as Michelle alluded to, there is such international meeting devoted to the topic of Ukraine's reconstruction. The first was in Lugano back in July of 2022. We were just talking about that a minute ago, and while it was a complicated conference, an initial conference, the principles laid out in the declaration that came out of the conference and in the principles articulated at the conference did a pretty good job of articulating the importance of addressing corruption, rule of law, the importance of multi-stakeholder involvement in the reconstruction process, that is, the inclusion of civil society, the private sector, and local entities in the process, and the overall importance of inclusivity in the process, that is, inclusion of women, minorities, elderly, people with disabilities, etc. Those were certainly laid out as important commitments in principle on paper. Subsequent plans developed by the World Bank in conjunction with the government of Ukraine and other international actors have also reinforced the importance of inclusivity and have looked at, in particular, the unique needs and requirements of the various groups I just described, which include folks like veterans, LGBTQI plus individuals, and the displaced as well as returnees. The World Bank has issued three plans in conjunction with the meetings they've held around Reconstruction, which folks can look at to get a sense of the details there. Another important document coming out of these recovery conferences is something called the Ukraine Business Compact, which emphasizes the importance of responsible business conduct by the private sector in its involvement in the reconstruction process. And indeed, over 600 companies at this point from Pact, which is a reassuring set of, hasn't been able to happen yet because of the ongoing conflict. But again, on paper and in principle, businesses have signed up to do the right thing in the reconstruction process. Last but not least is the EU accession process, which is part and parcel of the reconstruction of Ukraine. And the EU has developed a very comprehensive and detailed assessment of human rights and governance challenges in Ukraine. They've identified LGBTQI plus issues involving women. Importantly, the ongoing institutionalization of children and persons with disabilities, which I think Bill will touch on since Human Rights Watch has reported on that specifically. Issues involving national minorities, torture, and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment by the Ukrainian authorities on occasion. So, at least on paper, most of the planning documents, as well as initial implementation efforts at Reconstruction, have the majority of key human rights principles. But more needs to be done and seen to make sure that the government and the international community lives up to those commitments. So what did we choose to focus on in the report? Well, we sought to identify any gaps we felt there might be in the planning done to date. And we also sought to highlight what we thought were key issues that deserved special attention. The report first delves into a range of social divisions within the population. Some of them pre-existed the current conflict, but others have sort of come up over the course of the conflict. There continues to be a great deal of tension among religious communities within Ukraine, particularly between those communities that remain affiliated with the Russian Patriarch in Moscow, who has been an apologist for Putin's unjustified invasion. The vast majority of churches and religiously oriented people in Ukraine, however, have sought to distance themselves from the Russian Orthodox Church. Nonetheless, there are elements within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that have raised legitimate national security concerns that the Ukrainian government has sought to address. That said, those concerns need to be balanced with respect for religious freedom, not only within the Orthodox faiths, but with the many other faith traditions that exist in Ukraine. Another key issue that has cropped up since the war has been Ukrainian citizens' relationship to the war, either based on where they are located or what they have done regarding the war. Obviously, many Ukrainian men of military age have volunteered to fight Russia and continue to do so. But lots of folks, for various reasons, fled Ukraine. Many of them are Europe, some are in the United States and elsewhere. And I think a key question is, what should the Ukrainian government's posture be towards those people who may not either currently be in Ukraine or have contributed to the fight against Russia in the same way that some of the folks inside Ukraine have? The government has recently modified the national conscription law to broaden the universe of men who could serve in the Ukrainian military, but there have been some controversial measures taken, such as a denial of consular services, renewal of passports to Ukrainian men overseas, that have raised legitimate concerns. And I think those issues, if and when the war is over, are going to be important ones to take account of in the reconstruction process. I want to make clear that we don't question the Ukrainian government's legitimate right to conscript its citizens into the fight it has to make, but the way in which it has done so perhaps is a bit overly broad. We have also, in the report, identified the issue of mental health as a key issue for the government to address. Virtually all Ukrainians have been affected by the war in some way, some of them quite traumatically. And historically, Ukraine, as a consequence of its history as part of the Soviet Union, has not addressed mental health issues as thoroughly and comprehensively as it might have. And indeed, there's some stigma we found in folks seeking the mental health assistance they might need. And there's also limited capacity. So we think that's a key issue for the Ukrainian government and the international community to stay focused on. The deinstitutionalization of children and persons with disabilities, I've already referred to that. Bill and Human Rights Watch have done a report specifically on that issue, so I'll let him speak to that in more detail. But suffice it to say that Ukraine has the second highest number of children and persons with disabilities who have been institutionalized in Europe. The first is Russia, but Ukraine comes second. And addressing those communities in a more human rights appropriate way, we think, is important. Lastly, the report touches on transitional justice issues very briefly, because lots has been written about this and talked about in that space, and we didn't feel that we needed to get into it in detail as well. The issue of martial law, when it is lifted, how it is lifted, is obviously going to be crucial to Ukraine's respect for human rights going forward. And last but not least, support for the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights will be super important going forward. Ukraine needs to have the capacity for an independent entity to monitor Ukraine's human rights behavior and identify new issues as they come up. So, Michelle, that's the sum of the report, and most of the issues flowing out at the end of the report address the issues I have described. Back to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Scott. And I really appreciate that overview, as well as all the work that you and Lauren Burke put into putting this report together and making sure that it responds to the gaps that we see in the issues that we're discussing today. So with that great overview, I will turn over to the panel so we can have a broader discussion on many of these topics about centering human rights into Reconstruction. So our other two panelists are Melinda Herring, joining us today. She's an internationally recognized expert on Ukraine. We're absolutely delighted to have her here. She currently works as the Senior Community Engagement Advisor at Razom for Ukraine and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Previously, she was the deputy director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and editor of the Atlantic Council's popular publication, the Ukraine Alert blog. So many of our watchers today, I'm sure, are avid readers of that blog. Melinda has worked for the Superhuman Center, Eurasia Foundation, Freedom House, and the National Democratic Institute, and she has a master's in government with a certificate in Russian, Eurasian, and East European studies. So thank you so much for joining us. And we also have Bill Van Esveld, who is the Associate Director of the MENA and Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, where he's worked since beginning as a fellow in 2007. Before joining Human Rights Watch, Bill helped write a report on Iraq for the International Center for Transitional Justice and on human rights developments in the UN General Assembly for the International Service for Human Rights. He has a JD from NYU Law School, where he was a fellow at the Institute for International Law and Justice, and he was also the lead researcher and author of a very relevant 2023 report called We Must Provide a Family, Not Rebuild Orphanages, which was about the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine for children in Ukrainian residential institutions, the issue that Scott just previewed. So as we begin this panel, I mentioned in the beginning the sort of existential state of affairs. And I think as we've seen countless times in history, existential defense relations, national security issues, international security issues are often almost like a tidal wave that can eclipse human rights concerns, even though in this context, human rights and differentiating what Ukraine is doing on the world stage from Russia's actions is such a pillar of the objectives, for example, of U.S. support for Ukraine and U.S. foreign policy. So I think that, one of the intentions we have in having this panel is ensuring that the human rights principles are not secondary, they're not later, and recognizing that given the importance of Ukraine having a free and dignified future for all of its people, understanding how to best support them, even though they're in this fight, to make sure that they feel supported in building that future. So with that, I'll begin with my first question, which is that as numerous examples throughout history have shown, post-war reconstruction projects, if done poorly, can reinforce social divisions and they can actually sow the seeds for future conflict. So what is one human rights concern that you believe has been under-discussed in Ukraine's reconstruction plans, and why is it important? And so I'll actually turn to Melinda first. I'm going to ask everyone to join in on this response. But Melinda, if you don't mind going first, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Thanks, Michelle, for having me. And I'd like to congratulate Scott and Lauren on a terrific paper. I really recommend it. And I think it has a lot to offer the discussion. So thank you for doing this work. So the issue that's missing from these discussions about Ukrainian reconstruction is a really obvious one, but it's very overlooked. And it's the fact that Ukraine has not had a census since 2011, since 2001. It is now 2024. We cannot talk about rebuilding Ukraine in an inclusive, democratic, any of the wonderful words you want to use, sustainable way, if we don't know how many people live in Ukraine, if we don't know where they live, if we don't know basic facts about them. So I find the entire process and discussion around reconstruction irresponsible if you don't even acknowledge the elephant in the room. We don't even know how many Ukrainians are living in the country. We don't have good eyes and ears on how many left and how many have been displaced. And I'm not trying to be facetious with these issues. I've asked the best demographers, I've asked the best social scientists in Ukraine, what's the IDP count? How many people are in Europe? And these numbers are very fluid, and the government itself doesn't have a very good grasp of these numbers. And just to state something really obvious, Michelle, we need to know where people are going to end up. So there's been huge amounts of dislocation since 2014, not just since 2022. We've seen people, especially in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, have to relocate more than once. In Kharkiv right now, we see people being dislocated again for the second time. So this process is very fluid, but before we start planning and spending large amounts of money, let's do our homework and let's make sure that we have a census in the pipeline.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a really important point and really just a baseline for being able to effectively plan. I'll take the same question over to Bill. What is one human rights concern you believe has been under discussed?
Well, let me echo Melinda's thanks to you all for this excellent paper, and for the chance to be here. It's not a direct human rights concern per se, but I think we need to look more closely. Those of us in the human rights community look very closely at what decentralization has meant in terms of who's where does the buck stop when we're talking about Reconstruction? I mean, it often is really going to stop with local authorities whose budgets have been absolutely eviscerated. We want all sorts of good. Human Rights Watch wants all sorts of good things for the people of Ukraine, and me particularly for the kids, the children of Ukraine who are going through such horrors. But is it possible to get the funding directly to the folks who are going to be providing the support we want to see, including for education, including for the massive mental health as well as physical, reconstruction needs of each region and each municipality? It's a complicated picture. It's not that nobody's looking at it. It's not that it's escaped everyone's notice. But it is core to the way that funding needs to flow, needs to be monitored, needs to be tracked for efficiency and effectiveness. So that's where I would start. But just on the issue of numbers, I got to throw one last thing in there to back up what Melinda's saying. I mean, we've also seen the lack of really hard data on one of the most crucial children's rights issues in this conflict, which is Russia's abduction, deportation of children, including children who are in institutional settings, as well as kids from families. There isn't really fantastic hard data on all of those kids and where they are now. Now that's 99.9% is the fault of Russia, Belarus, and the arrest warrants that have been issued for Putin and Lvova Belova. But we on the pro-democracy, pro-Ukraine side can do much more. The pro-human rights side, I should say, can do much more to be supporting efforts to just get the numbers right and to be able to track those kids. Thanks.
Great points, and I'll turn to Scott for similar opening. If you think you've already mentioned kind of what our report at CSIS thought was missing, but if there was one additional thing you wanted to add, what would it be?
I think it's a corollary to Melinda's point on knowing who the population is. In the course of doing the report, we came across several references to the demographic crisis that Ukraine is going to face in the future in terms of having able-bodied men and women to do what needs to be done to make Reconstruction a success and for Ukraine to thrive. So in the context of formulating social policy, I think the government and the international community needs to think about how to get people back to Ukraine, how to take advantage to some extent of people who are overseas in terms of the resources and expertise they have. But how does the government get those people back? One of the concerns raised about the conscription policy and the refusal to provide consular services is that the government is alienating a significant part of that population that is now outside Ukraine. And I think the goal should be to get that population back, if at all possible, while legitimately recognizing the differences between those Ukrainians who stayed in Ukraine and fought and those who may have chosen to be outside the country.
These are great points, and I think a precursor to our discussion to be able to center these recommendations and discussion in things that are practical and useful, but center human rights. So I will go to Melinda to ask a different question, which kind of relates to this idea of displacement that you talked about, and piggybacking on what Scott said about the fact that if the millions of Ukrainians who have been displaced, as you mentioned, since 2014 and now outside the country since the invasion, this could have serious economic and demographic consequences for the country going forward. So how can the Ukrainian government incentivize the return of those who are displaced, especially, working age adults? And specifically, how will they be able to take advantage of this reconstruction period to leverage foreign aid, potentially, if that's what you think is part of the diagnosis or part of the solution in this regard?
Michelle, Ukraine has to win the war. If you want Ukrainians to come back, able-bodied Ukrainians to come back, the one factor that sticks out in all of the polling is security, security, security. It's their number one, number two, number three concern. There are no airports that currently work, so it's very difficult. I've been over 5 times since the big war started, and each a trip is awful in its own way and takes forever. So, it makes it very difficult for Ukrainians to come back and forth and maintain their sort of family unity. But security is the number one, and it's obvious and it's hard, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. But the sort of points that would follow that are housing and jobs, and around housing, jobs, and education. And you have to have a cluster system. It has to be thought through well. If people had their homes destroyed, they have to have safe housing. They have to have some kind of economic opportunities. And then they need to have safe housing for their children. And there's not enough schools that have, particularly in the East. So I think, sorry, I have to say lots of obvious things. Ukraine is a very big country, and there's a lot of differences. So if you live on the front lines, if you live in Zaporizhia, your kids are not in school. They have not been in school for 2 years because of COVID. They have not been in school for 2 years because of the big war. This is a big problem, and it's going to cause enormous problems and life decreases in lifelong earnings for Ukrainian children. This is one of my biggest worries for children along the front line. So I have a 9-year-old daughter. If I were, Svetlana, and I lived in Zaporizhia, my daughter would have been out of school for between 3 and 4 years, depending on where you are. And they are not reopening these schools because they don't have shelters that are up to standard. And rockets can get to Zaporizhia, to Kharkiv, very, very quickly. A lot of families have chosen to leave, and they've relocated to safer places. But at the top of my priority list would be schools, and making sure that underground shelters are available and they're up to standard so that we can get kids back for in-person delivery. It's essential to the recovery and to the long-term health of Ukraine.
Thank you so much. I mean, thank you for being obvious. I mean, those are things that I think people that are not displaced by war, it's easy to have the luxury of talking about theoretical things, but the practical elements are essential. Piggybacking on that, in 2022, you wrote that 3 obstacles that Ukraine must overcome to build a successful post-war future, in addition to the ones you stated, are corruption, poor governance, and broken courts. So I was wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit about, those issues, which I know have gotten a lot of attention, but how citizens can, when the war ends and there is safety and security, how can citizens push the government to use that reconstruction period to essentially, build back better in terms of integrity, transparency, accountability, and inclusivity?
So this is where I get to be positive finally. So Ukrainian civil society is awesome. Ukrainian civil society is more vibrant than American civil society. They have real muscle. And I can say, as someone who is in an advocacy role, I learn from Ukrainian civil society every day. They are so smart and so good at what they do. So hats off to them. And civil society is very well developed, and they know how to make their voices heard. They've been key to every single big reform since 2014, since the democratic opening that we saw with the Euromaidan. So I'm not worried about civil society in Ukraine. This article that I wrote about corruption, poor governance, broken courts, those things are all problems, and they're all serious problems. They have not gotten better. Corruption is worse now since the big war started, and no one wants to talk about that. But I think if we're going to be honest brokers, I want Ukraine to win the war, and I work for Ukraine's victory every single day. But if we're going to be honest brokers, we have to be honest about the scale of corruption in Ukraine. It is a problem. Law enforcement bodies are coming around and knocking on doors again. This is something that has to be rooted out if Ukraine is going to succeed. Poor governance is a even bigger problem than it was before the war. The president's chief of staff has established a power vertical. All of the embassies know about it. They call him out privately, but no one wants to talk about it publicly because we want Ukraine to win the war, and we don't want Russian propaganda to take advantage of that. The courts are still totally broken. The Constitutional Court is a disaster and has not been reformed. So in order for Ukraine to recover, it has to do these very, very basic things. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you can't talk about reconstruction and recovery if you have broken courts. No foreign direct investors are not stupid. They know what is going on in Ukraine, and they are not going to invest their money in Ukraine until the constitutional court is fixed, the vertical of power is removed, and the corruption problem is fixed. But I think that Bill nailed something really, really important on decentralization. And this is where I love one of the recommendations, Bill and Lauren, in your report. Point one, you guys said the reconstruction process must be human-centric, inclusive, and locally driven in a way that reaches all regions of the country. That's so important because Ukraine is super diverse and it's extremely different. So in America, Mississippi is very different from my home state of Alaska, and that's part of the strength of America. Ukraine has very strong regional differences, and we need to let Zaporizhia be Zaporizhia and Rivne be Rivne, and that has to come out in the reconstruction process. And that means we have really competent, as a result of decentralization, which is the least sexy reform that Ukraine has ever encountered. It is so boring, but it is so important because it gave local authorities a chance to show that they are competent. So they proved their competency through COVID and then now through the war. So I am optimistic about reconstruction on a local level if the big guys in Kiev don't muck it up. So all the eyeballs need to be on Kiev to make sure that this process is transparent and that the money goes to local authorities and it is that there's a demand signal, from Rivne, from Chernivtsi, and not from Kiev.
Extremely strong points, and thank you for picking up on decentralization and on the need for that support and non-interference. I think from national authorities, especially when we potentially are, I think, looking at a large injection of funds into potential reconstruction. When it's done, it's history has shown that can be a recipe for increased corruption or those funds not going downward in the way that they should to local governing authorities. So thank you for those great points. One of the things that people have been using as a baseline here are the Lugano Declaration and Principles. They lay out specifically human rights and governance commitments for Ukrainian reconstruction, and that is forming the basis for reconstruction plans that are developed by the World Bank. I understand, Linda, from our brief chat before this that the actual first iteration of that conference was maybe did not have the basis in reality that would have been needed in that situation. I wanted to give Scott and you a chance to talk about kind of the baseline they established. Are the principles relevant? Are they the right ones? And what obstacles do you see for putting those principles into practice? So I'll start with Scott and then maybe give Melinda a chance too if you want to weigh in on that.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, I was not at the Lugano conference as Melinda was, so I'll let her speak to the realities of the conference. But in looking over the documents themselves, they look pretty good. They clearly identify a range of human rights and governance issues as important ones to address in the reconstruction process. So from a purely a documentary standpoint, I think they're pretty good. I do think what is missing there are some of these issues unique to Ukraine, be they the religious divisions I described, to some extent the linguistic divisions that may exist in the country, and then importantly, these divisions based on people's experience of the war. I do think in the reconstruction process, the Ukrainian authorities and the international community need to be super sensitive to those new fissures that may have emerged over the course of the conflict.
Thank you. And Melinda, since you were there, we'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this question as well.
Sure, glad to. I think Scott just nailed something super important about the new fissures that have emerged. Michelle, I promise I will address Lugano, but I have to say a sentence about this. Ukraine has changed. I've been following Ukraine for 15 years. I eat, breathe, and sleep Ukraine. I've lived there on and off, and I've never seen Ukraine change so much since the big war started. And society is changing in leaps and bounds. And I think that it's good to do this planning process, but it needs to be done well and with the reality, the full reality that social organisms change, and we need to be on top of those change. Chatham House has just released a lot of really interesting data about attitudes in Ukraine. So I would encourage anyone who's involved in these planning discussions to have modesty and humility, even if you know Ukraine, because in some ways I don't recognize the society. It's changing because of the different experiences of war. So I think, Scott, that's a super important point, and one that should really be underlined and highlighted a couple of times. Now, Lugano was the first conference, and it occurred 5 months after the war began. And I had sort of a mind-body experience, because Scott's right, the documentation was fine. It's anodyne. It's, sort of typical Reconstruction documents. The actual experience of the conference was, like I said, it was an out-of-body experience. So Ukraine had just kicked the Russians out of Kiev, and there was a sense of elation. And then the Ukrainians were stuck in the Donbass, and there was a sense of despair. And this wasn't just for friends of Ukraine. This wasn't just for Western partners like me and my colleagues on this call. This was for Ukrainians. So Ukrainian civil society was despairing at this conference, and we were talking about these grand ideas, sort of the Jetson cities of the future. And it was this sort of disconnect between we may die, we may not live another day, and let's create, spaceships. Like it was really completely disconnected. So that was the biggest problem I had. The second problem I had with Lugano was that the conference claimed to be inclusive, and it was not. So the government went on stage and they made, very attractive presentations. They were trying to bring in FDI. I understand why they did what they did. They claimed that they consulted civil society. I was sitting in the body of the conference with a bunch of civil society actors, and they were complaining loudly that we were not consulted. That has gotten better. So the good thing that I can say is that this is the third conference in this series of conferences, and the Ukrainian government is consulting Ukrainian civil society, and I think they feel like they're getting a chance to be part of it now. So thank God.
I don't think so.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad to hear that it is getting better, especially with this important issue of inclusivity. I want to turn to Bill. Human Rights Watch has been such a strong voice, including just this week, thinking about what Reconstruction should look like, and particularly about the priority of issues like children, mental and physical disability, and mental health treatment. In your view, when it comes to the issue of deinstitutionalization that you mentioned, are there models that Ukraine should follow, and where should funding be directed to support deinstitutionalization and the rights of children?
Thanks so much for letting me focus on this question. I think it's really important. Like Scott said, there were 105,000 kids stuck in these institutions before the full-scale Russian invasion. And, it's a tragic irony. Like, there was the invasion that highlighted another harmful Soviet-era legacy, which was the risks to these kids in these institutions, most of which were built in the 50s. So that's what we're dealing with. We've got this very harmful legacy. I'm not going to spend time on this briefing talking about why institutions are so harmful, but you can just look at the disconnect between those massive sort of Dickensian warehouses of kids out in the countryside and what the European Union has moved towards, which is something that respects the rights of kids to live in families, in communities. There's lots of models that Ukraine could follow, and there's lots of support that the European Union and its member states could be offering, and some are. There have been study visits organized by Ukrainian civil society. Just to bolster something that Melinda said on the specific little focus on deinstitutionalization, civil society really was not being consulted at the beginning of things when it came to Reconstruction funding and institutions for kids. I think that has improved in this area as well, as Melinda was saying. So what we want to see is follow the basic, human rights of people with disabilities, kids with disabilities. Who were the kids who were stuck in these institutions before the full-scale invasion? A lot of them had disabilities, and a lot of them were just from families without a lot of money, where this sort of heritage encouraged families to send their kids off to these institutions, thinking that it would be better for the kids. when in fact we know the outcomes are way worse for kids who get sent off to one of these facilities. So, there's lots of good stuff to follow. I mean, and some of it is relatively recent. Like Poland, I think it was only 2012 or something like that, that they changed their laws so that the maximum number of kids in a facility was limited to less than 14. So this is not ancient history in a lot of these countries. There's a lot to offer. I think, again, to echo what Melinda was saying, who are the real experts here? Who are the world leading experts on children's rights in some of these areas? They're actually Ukrainian groups. And I'm learning a ton from them. There's Hope and Homes for Children. There's the Ukrainian Child Rights Network that we just released a piece with about the upcoming Reconstruction conference. So there's an awful lot. There are pilot projects going on right now in Ukraine in the midst of this existential war that's aimed at destroying the nation. There are pilot projects to deinstitutionalize in the midst of this armed conflict. Like, Ukraine has really shown the way in the midst of the worst atrocities you can imagine to try and preserve a better future for its children. So there's a lot to say about that, but I think we got to keep listening to the civil society, to the Ukrainian NGOs, and that's what we need Ukraine and its supporters to be pushing for to continue.
Thank you. That is so important. And I think also just to have that dose of inspiration coming from out of this hardship, to see how many people in Ukraine, local civil society, all around the country have banded together, using their ingenuity and expertise to create things like that. So I'm so happy to hear both of you amplifying those voices so that our viewers in this DC audience, and we have viewers from all around the world, but we have a lot of viewers in DC, can think about that when they are looking at the issue of Reconstruction. Before we go to the audience Q&A, I did want to ask, considering the progress that has been made that you've all referred to in terms of consultation, in bringing civil society into these discussions, if you had one ask for those that are going to be attending the recovery conference next week in Berlin on Ukraine recovery, what would that be? And I think I'll start, Bill, just since I went to you last, I'll start with you first this time.
Thanks. Well, I think, in my focus on children's rights issues, we need to keep it on the agenda because we need the reformers in Ukraine to get the financial support, but also the political support from the outside to keep doing what they're doing. When we talk about care reform for older people, people with disabilities, and kids, these are reform issues that civil society in Ukraine has been pushing for decades. And often they found themselves going backwards instead of going forwards because there was not outside support or strong financial support for the reforms. And there was a pretty entrenched lobby, in some cases inside Ukraine, that, did clever things like said, we want to deinstitutionalize children, but we're going to exclude kids with disabilities from care reform. So it's only the other kids who deserve to live in families, but not the kids who are assessed to have a disability. We got to keep our eye on sort of sneaky stuff like that. We got to keep our eye on the ball of the money as well. I mean, let's not forget that the first big report on reconstruction for Ukraine that came out, World Bank, EU, UN signed off on it. And everybody had said, we're not going to fund the reconstruction of these big institutions for kids. Guess what? In that report, there was a line item that said it was more than 100 million euros for reconstruction of these facilities. So we need to track where the money's going. Things have improved greatly since then. The EU facility for Ukraine has good language in it. The EU Ukraine Human Rights Dialogue focused very much on these issues. But we got to keep our eye on the ball because there's a lot of vested interest that would like to see this money go to perpetuate things that are harmful for kids rather than stuff that's good for Ukraine. The very last thing, I don't want to talk too long, but just how are we going to do that? We need support for the reformers, and we need support for independent monitoring of the results on the ground. So there's got to be civil society involvement in the planning phase. There's got to be involvement of the affected people themselves. So people with disabilities, their voices need to be heard and very carefully considered. And there's got to be independent monitoring of where the funding is going.
Thank you. And those are very strong recommendations. Could definitely understand why those would be so essential in supporting the civil society that are working to create that future they deserve. Scott, do you have any thoughts on the kind of for the recovery conference? If they were to think about one particular thing, what message would you send them?
I want to come back to our last recommendation, which is to ensure both adequate funding for the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as the independence of that role. It is mostly independent now, but there do need to be some legal changes to make sure that it is fully independent, because I think the existence of that institution will help to ensure ongoing attention to the various human rights issues we've identified.
Thank you. And Melinda?
So, Michelle, the conference has 4 different dimensions. It has a business dimension, a human dimension, a local and regional dimension, and then an EU dimension. And I think that that ordering makes a lot of sense. But I think that the bigger piece of advice that I would have is go Ukrainian. And Bill and I have both hit on this, and I want to be really explicit. Have humility. Ukrainians are already rebuilding their society. They're not waiting around for us to, develop a beautiful Marshall Plan. Many of the places that had the worst damage have been rebuilt already. Are they going to need our assistance? Yes. Is it going to be the project of our lifetimes? Yes. But Ukrainians know their societies far better than we do. They know how to get things done quickly. They know the needs on the ground. So my big message in all of these different thematic areas is always to go Ukrainian.
That is such an important message, I think, especially for our DC friends and policymakers, because so much of the way that the US government gives its assistance tends to be in a way that is sort of prescribed and kind of decided down from the top, as opposed to injecting money into local civil society and local government institutions to do it. So I know that even our appropriations legislation has provisions in it that sort of limit the U.S. government's ability to do government-to-government assistance. But that's exactly what you would need if you were to support local government institutions in the decentralization, or to just put more money directly in the hands of civil society. So just echoing your point that this is important for our DC audience to hear, because it's often paradoxical that in the places where they see as the most chaotic or with the most conflict and violence, they feel they need to have more and more control over those funds, when in reality it's actually the flexibility that local civil society on the ground, who knows their context best and how to maneuver in it, they need that money to be able to to exercise that expertise with US funds. So just echoing how important that is. I'll move into the audience Q&A in one moment, as we're seeing some questions roll in. And for those watching, please remember, you can go to the event page and just click on that Ask Questions Live to be able to give us a question that you want us to ask the panelists in the next few minutes. But the one other thing I wanted to go back to is, Scott in the report has brought up, I think, some really tricky issues when it comes to this idea of the conduct of citizens in regards to how the perception of how they supported the war, and then kind of giving a cautionary tale about the idea of kind of not considering that overbalancing that in the Reconstruction response. It hints at a lot of tensions amongst people that are putting their lives on the line in the conflict, and may have feelings about those who they see as not doing that. But in terms of the human rights apparatus, legal apparatus, I'm not aware of a distinction that is kind of supposed to be made on those grounds. And so I'm curious to hear if Melinda or Bill wanted to say anything about that tricky subject of how to balance, the needs and desires of those who are, have come together to fight the war, with those that want to come together to build it and treat one another equally despite those tensions. It's a hard question, so just curious if you have any thoughts on that. I'm looking at who's nodding. Maybe Bill, you look like you might be unmuting, so I'll start with you.
Well, I'm unmuting because I'm hoping that Melinda will save me. Something very intelligent.
Hey, you're the lawyer. You're the lawyer. You're
what human rights framework, which is sort of the framework of this discussion we're having right now, provides is sort of the bare minimum, right? So it's sort of what you can't do to somebody. So and what that boils down to is you can't discriminate on illegitimate grounds. Now, there's flexibility in there. There's leeway in there. It doesn't come from Mars. It doesn't come from the moon. It comes from, the real experiences of states after World War II, after the devastation of World War II. And it's sort of you could think of it as a framework for, what have we learned from the devastation in Europe, and what is a more efficient way of going about governing. And it turns out that not repressing people and not violating their rights might be the best way to keep societies together. So that's a very, wishy-washy answer, but I'm thinking of things like, the collaboration trials of some people who were teachers in occupied territory. Now, I don't have anything to say about that unless those people don't get a fair trial, unless the laws under which they're being prosecuted don't allow them to make a defense of coercion, like they didn't have any volition in doing it. Things like this are very, very basic, but it provides an easy framework to do a sort of checklist. Is a human right being violated? If it is, then whatever the political rationale behind it shouldn't stand.
Thank you. That's a thoughtful answer. And Belinda, if you would like to say anything, no pressure to.
I think that my lawyer nailed it better than I can. But it is a tricky issue, and I think that there's a huge amount of sensitivity around it, and Ukrainians are working through it. I think the most intelligent thing I can say is that Ukrainians will find a way to work through it. This is one of those social fissures, and we have to give them the space and time to work through it.
Very respectful answer. I appreciate that. So I'll go to some audience questions. We've seen a couple come in as we've been talking about the sort of, future justice issues in the future. How can it be ensured that perpetrators of human rights violations are held accountable? And we're also seeing, a question on sort of what role civil society can play in those transitional justice processes and support victims in the long term, especially kind of outside the normal court structures. So memorialization, the push for greater mental health. I'm curious if anyone wants to take a stab at that question on, the civil society role, and then on sort of the transitional justice and accountability elements that are so critical to healing.
I'll take a stab at the first part if Scott will jump in and do the hard part. Ukrainian civil society is doing an amazing job trying to document war crimes. And I think this is a big piece of what the West can do as well. So because there are so many war crimes and because the evidentiary responsibilities are very, very heavy and hard in a war zone, Western governments have done an amazing job sending over investigatory teams, laptops, rape kits. It goes on and on and on. We know how to do this very well, and I think we should continue to lead in on this. But there's, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but there is a world-class Ukrainian organization that is leading the way on this, knows how to document. But I think this is where the West can come alongside and provide technical support on documentation to make sure that everything's safe in the cloud, but also on the technical side as well.
Really great answer. And Bill, would you like to, or Scott, either one, would you like to jump in?
Can I just say that in the process of writing this report and digging a little bit into the transitional justice issue, I was struck by the huge number of allegations of abuses and atrocities. There are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of cases out there. And in an ideal world, every victim should have the feeling that their government and the international community is going to hold the perpetrator of the abuse they suffered accountable. But as a practical matter, that is going to be nearly impossible to do. As Melinda's already pointed out, the court system is already super challenged, overburdened, and so I do think it's going to be really important for Ukraine as a society to think about what alternatives might there be to the traditional legal processes that bring accountability. Is it simply the documentation, the thorough documentation of abuses? Is it a process like that, say in South Africa, in which perpetrators are identified but are not held accountable through a formal legal process? So I do think there needs to be thought given to this. I do think, as Melinda and Bill have both said, the role of civil society will be crucial in that regard. But I think Bill and I are both lawyers coming out of a very developed legal system where there are lots of legal processes for holding people who commit abuses accountable. And I just don't think that infrastructure it's certainly not as developed in Ukraine, nor given the thousands of allegations, is it going to be capable of doing all that needs to be done for those legal processes to work to their conclusion. So I think alternative mechanisms and forms of accountability do need to be looked at carefully.
Great.
just
Well, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
real fast. I'm just like, when you asked that question, the first sort of face that came to mind is Alexandra Matvichuk from the Center for Civil Liberties, right? She's incredible. They're incredible. They don't need donors to tell them what to work on. They need donors to be supporting them to do what they're doing and what they know how to do best. And we all need that. Anybody who cares about international justice or international law, the rules-based order, we need them to succeed, and they can succeed by getting funding to do what they know how to do. Let's not do a top-down thing of like, let's focus on the flavor of the month in terms of accountability or new tech stuff, or, like I've seen this in many countries. Let's not see it here. We can do a lot better than that by just listening.
That is, again, such a powerful message for folks in DC that might be sending representation to these conferences, coming up with funding plans. Way too often, like you said, we see it as a flavor of the month approach by donors rather than a listening approach to center voices of credible experts on the ground that are already doing this, that just need to be enabled, and need to be enabled not just for their new visionary project with a long grant application, but kind of direct funding to support all of their operations to be able to carry out their work and even keep the lights on. So I really appreciate those. So in our last just 3 minutes, I'd love to go around for just a closing sense from each of you, reflecting on this conversation. If there is a point that about human rights, centering human rights in Reconstruction and engaging civil society around it, that gives you hope for what the way forward should be, especially as given the conference next week to talk about recovery. Is there a particular approach or way forward that you think that maybe is already happening or should be happening that you think should be taken up? I think we can end on that note of specificity. So I will start with Melinda and then go to Scott and then end with Bill.
Thank you. Yes. So not only go Ukrainian, but go with Ukraine's women. So I'm not being an arch feminist here. Because of the war, the role of women in Ukraine is being reshaped. In last year, we saw 56% of new businesses were opened by women. And women right now don't have to fight on the front lines. And we're seeing the power dynamics change as well. We're seeing a huge boon for women's careers. They're now, all kinds of leadership positions are open to them that haven't been open in a way before, and business opportunities as well. So I think that's an important part of the Reconstruction process and one to keep in mind.
That is an excellent point, and I'm embarrassed that we didn't talk about it sooner, given how critical that is, and to not just the role of women, but women as change agents and leaders in these issues. Seen that all over the Ukraine response. Then to Scott.
Again, I want to touch on one of our recommendations on the importance of the Ukrainian government maintaining an enabling environment for civil society. There have been lots of governments around the world, some of them democratic governments, that have been tempted to limit civil society. Look at the law recently adopted in Georgia. Now, admittedly, a different country, but not far from Ukraine. And I can imagine that civil society, their job is to be a pain in the neck. Their job is to hold governments accountable, to call out governments when they are not respecting human rights. And it can be tempting for governments to try to clamp down on civil society when it does those sorts of things. So I think it's really important that the Ukrainian government maintain such an enabling environment, and that the international community continue to support civil society. One sector of society we haven't talked about is the media. Under the martial law, there have been some restrictions on the media. There are still lots of good independent reporting, don't get me wrong. It's not like the government has totally cracked down on the media, but again, maintaining an enabling environment for the media is also going to be very important going forward, so that the media can call attention to and hold accountable government and other actors as they undertake the reconstruction process.
Thanks, and see lots of nodding on that one. And Bill, any closing thoughts you have on any specific approach you think they should think about taking or are taking that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, with the specific issue of deinstitutionalization, I think we've seen progress in Ukrainian authorities listening more to civil society groups in Ukraine, and that's excellent. What I wanted to just say is that, I mean, I really just agree completely with everything Scott and Melinda have said, but to add one specific theme, education. Let's go back to education, which is where Melinda started. I mean, you can't make a better investment in a country than investing in accessible education. And I think you could see it almost as a tragic moment of opportunity. So many schools have been decimated and destroyed by Russian attacks, and the Ukrainian authorities are really trying to build back better in terms of safety and security by making sure schools have bomb shelters so the kids can go there, get in-person education, which is the only really effective kind, and also be safe. While you're in the midst of doing that, you can also make those schools accessible and you can make them inclusive. If you're building a bomb shelter, you can widen the doors, you can build ramps, you can make sure a kid doesn't have to be carried up the stairs in a humiliating way to a classroom on the second floor if they're in a wheelchair. You know, let's build back better in an inclusive way, and you know, it's possible, and we should be supporting that.
Well, thank you so much to all of you distinguished panelists. I'm certainly humbled to have gotten the chance to moderate this conversation, and I appreciate the overwhelming chorus of support for Ukrainian civil society who are leading the way. We'll be sure to post this online so that folks can watch this afterward. And I just want to give a thanks to our program manager and co-author of the report, the CSIS report, Lauren Burke, as well as CSIS's broadcasting team, streaming and broadcasting team, for making this event possible, as well as OSF for providing us funding to be able to have events like these and produce this kind of report. So thank you to everyone. Please tune in afterward. And if we were in person, I would say let's have a round of applause for all of you. We'll just have to have a at our desk silent round of applause for our panelists. Thank you again for joining CSIS today.